Fortress of Fear was released for the original Game Boy back in 1990, and was the first and only handheld game in the somewhat obscure Wizards & Warriors series. Though published by Acclaim, the series was actually developed by Rare Limited, the same Rare who would go on to become one of the most revered developers in the industry, with their catalogue of critically and commercially successful releases throughout the 90s and early 2000s, before being bought out and subsequently ruined by Microsoft. The original Wizards & Warriors was a fairly well-received NES title upon its release in North America in 1987. The game, in which the player controls the warrior Kuros in his quest to defeat the evil wizard Malkil, was commended at the time for its non-linear gameplay style, which combined platforming, combat, and exploration in the game's large open 2D levels. In fact, the only real criticism raised at the time was aimed at the game's lack of challenge, due to the unlimited continues and instant respawns. In Fortress of Fear, Kuros must once again don his armour and battle countless foes over the game's 5 chapters in order to reach and defeat his arch-nemesis and all-round bastard, Malkil the Wizard. As with the first Wizards & Warriors, the gameplay is a blend of platforming and combat. However, when compared to the large open levels of the original game, the stages here are a much more linear affair, with the objective typically being to make your way from left to right until you reach the exit. There are, however, numerous secret areas littered throughout the game, which reward the more adventurous player. Apparently taking on board the criticism levelled at the previous game, the infinite continues have been removed, and instead the player starts the game with a meagre 3, with the odd extra one being placed in chests and hidden areas throughout the game. Once these are gone, however, the game is over and must be started again from the beginning. This makes the game extremely difficult to finish, and certainly feels like Rare went from one extreme to the other in their attempt to balance the difficulty. Kuros walks at a somewhat sluggish pace, and feels floaty when jumping, which can make the platforming sections more frustrating and difficult than they really ought to be. The plucky knight will also take damage when he falls from a certain height, so care has to be taken from the player when choosing which platforms are safe to jump to. Kuros can stab enemies with his sword by using the B button, and can perform an overhead slash by pressing up and B. Due to the fairly short range of the weapon though, he needs to be up close and personal to strike the sprightly enemies, and oftentimes will take unavoidable damage in the process. Strangely, the power of the sword swing seems inconsistent, as enemies that usually disappear after one hit will suddenly be able to survive 2 or more attacks. This can lead to frustrating deaths, and further add to the game's difficulty. On the plus side, Kuros' armour affords him a life bar, which allows him to take a few hits before kicking the bucket. He can also consume any food and drink he finds lying around to gain back lost health, with the booze in particular doing a good job of patching him up. If he finds a key lying around, he will be able to open one of the various treasure chests he will often pass. These can contain gems, which are utterly useless, a healing potion, which will refill his life bar, a shield of protection, which will offer a little more defense, and boots of jumping, which allows him to jump higher. Sadly, dying will cause him to lose any keys and items he previously acquired, which wouldn't be such a problem if not for the fact that certain platforming sections require you to have the boots of jumping. Luckily, such sections are usually fairly close to a key and chest containing said boots, so in those instances you won't have to backtrack too far. The graphics are fairly respectable for an early Game Boy title, but otherwise unremarkable. The character and enemy sprites are simple, but a decent size, and the levels are kept fairly sparse in detail, which at least makes it easy to see what you're doing. Reviewers of the time complained the game suffered from ghosting. However, when playing on anything other than an original dot matrix Game Boy, this problem doesn't seem to be apparent. The game's music is composed by none other than David Wise, who has since gone on to become a legend in the video game industry. Fortress of Fear, while not up there with the best of his work, occasionally has its moments. The title music is a definite highlight. It's a short loop, but one that you could happily sit and listen to for a few minutes before starting the game. I know I do anyway. Sadly, the in-game music is a mixed bag, with the first level theme being particularly offensive on the ears. Yeah, that's enough of that. Later stages get a bit better, but really the only other track worthy of turning up is the not entirely awful boss music. Fortress of Fear is a difficult game for me to objectively review, as it's a title that I have fond memories of playing as a child. I remember asking my dad to buy me the game from Toys R Us in the early 90s. I was around 8 years old at the time, and obsessed with swords and sorcery, and the Conan-esque figure depicted on the front of the box was enough to win me over. I seem to remember being a little disappointed when I realised the character in the game wasn't actually a long-haired, muscle-bound barbarian, but instead a goofy, Monty Python-esque knight. Nevertheless, I played the game to death, and although I never got very far in it, it remains one of the defining games of my childhood. The primitive graphics, high difficulty, and floaty platforming will certainly mar newcomers' enjoyment of the game, but even so I feel it's a game worth having in your collection. If nothing else, it's an early piece of Rare's history, complete with a David Wise soundtrack, and it doesn't hurt that the game can be picked up easily for a few pounds. So if you like what you've seen, why not fire up your Game Boy and take on the perilous journey through the Fortress of Fear?